At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Joining me on the pod today is Jill Butler, a fierce protector of ancient and veteran trees and their many values to wildlife and society, architect of the UK's Ancient Tree Inventory and winner of the Arboricultural Association Award in 2020. Jill and I talk about the wonders of old trees and what we can learn from other countries to better protect them. We speak about her work recording champion trees with the Tree Register and her vision for a future-proof environment that provides much more for nature. Jill, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. We're delighted to have you on as a guest, and I wonder if you might just start off by telling us how people will know you and I guess a potted history of your career with trees, if you don't mind.
Well, my history of trees probably dates back to actually when I really focused on them was when I joined the Woodland Trust, which was in the mid-90s, 1990s. But previous to that, I've always been really interested in conservation and the countryside. And I was lucky enough to grow up on the edge of Chobham Common and Horsell Common. And I spent a lot of time there. And that really was very much an influence on me. I always wanted to be doing something in the way of biology or something like that. And I was very lucky that I managed to get to do a postgraduate course, which was on landscape ecology, design and maintenance. It was very early in the origin of those sorts of courses, really. And then I've spent a whole career in countryside management of some sort or other, but I had to really focus on trees when I joined the Woodland Trust, and it was really, quite a lesson then in terms of being initially a site manager, and then being very, very lucky to be in the position where I was given the job of being their ancient tree and wood pasture specialist. And that I did for about 20 years. And that was just such a real wonderful, wonderful career and a wonderful way to spend the peak of one's working life doing that sort of thing. Really fantastic.
But what I'm really curious to kind of investigate with our guests is what trees mean to you at a fundamental level. And might that be linked to, I don't know, perhaps childhood experiences or, an exposure to trees at that time?
My early experiences are exposure to countryside and particularly heathland and common land. And actually now one would reflect on the nature of that heathland and common land because so much of it was, the grazing was abandoned. And now it's secondary regeneration. And actually that's been, really quite a dramatic change for those landscapes, really. I don't think I really started to get this association with trees until I started to have to focus on it in terms of my work with the Woodland Trust. And then you meet such wonderful trees that are obviously really huge, really spectacular. I know it's in the eye of the beholder, but their great age. You know how unusual you are. You know how special they are for the biodiversity. And it's such an adventure to go around the countryside and walk down a new footpath, for example, and come around the corner and there is this spectacular pollard. These trees at that age, when they've got to that stage, are all individuals. You can see a photograph of a tree that you haven't seen for a year or so, and you know the tree. It's just like you know people. You've got to bear in mind that really I came to trees just at the start of the interest in ancient trees. And so my perspective has really always been influenced by that post-mature life stage of trees. And what really excites me is that having these mega plants, these things that are growing for hundreds of years and are huge structures, that we've only really just started to see these ancient trees where they've been in the landscape quite clearly for a very, very long time. And that they are changing all sorts of aspects of how we've understood the world, really. The fact that we have so many open-grown ancient trees, you have to then look at that landscape and think, well, how have they been kept open in that particular time? And as we know with, for example, oaks, they grow for 300 years, rest for 300 years, and spend 300 years gracefully declining. Being an open-grown tree for 900 years, how does that happen? Why are we not more aware of that? What do we know about how that works?
Would it be fair to say that you've been an activist for the protection of those ancient trees that you so dearly care about?
Yes.
I just wanted to check you're comfortable with that term.
Yes.
So then, I guess in that space and in the way that you've been able to advocate for their protection, and thank goodness somebody has, by the way, I wonder if you might share a most tragic loss in that time, maybe a biggest success, actually, where yourself and others might have saved a tree. What comes to mind?
Well, I think one of the big successes in my time has been the introduction of the concept of irreplaceability of ancient and veteran trees in the National Planning Policy Framework, and getting them given that national status. Unfortunately, that understanding about how important they are nationally isn't transferred necessarily into every walk of life. The government has stated that they are to be protected because they're so important, but that doesn't always get translated across. So a great benefit has been recognising that you have to have wholly exceptional reasons in a planning situation to lose such trees. It doesn't seem that has actually, the understanding of that has reached all the stakeholders that are playing a part in trying to protect what we should be trying to protect in the landscape.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think it's fair to say we're still waiting for that to manifest. I just wondered if you might have a message for, I guess, people that might not work in the tree industry, and what would you say to them about perhaps what they might do if they feel inclined to protect these really special trees that we're talking about?
Well, a first step is to check whether they're on the ancient tree inventory, because this is a citizen science project that was set up about 20 years ago, and anyone can record a tree to the ancient tree inventory. It doesn't give it protection because it's just a database and an inventory, but it does mean that we're compiling a lot more information about where these trees are. And, just think about it. We've got all these trees which are hundreds of years old and we don't know where they all are. I mean, something that probably predates most of our buildings, the way we live our lives, and so historic, so much part of our heritage, and we don't know where they are. It is just amazing and so people can add records. And I have to say that many, many, many hundreds of people have recorded trees and they get it. I mean, this is the wonderful thing. When I look at the records on the ancient tree inventory, so many of the people know what we mean by an old tree, and, they want to help. So I've really encouraged them to do that. And then obviously that is evidence. If you have a planning application in that is going to impact on the trees that are on the ancient tree inventory, that's really good evidence that that should be protected. So use the ancient tree inventory in that way. And, I won't be around, but in 100 years, I think, we will have this wonderful database to look back on. You can upload loads of images to individual trees. And I hope that, through updating with images, we will start to understand a lot more about trees' lives over, decades, really, and learn more about what the problems are and what the successes are.
My view is that to face into the climate and biodiversity crises that we're facing collectively, we need to look further back in time, perhaps to access land management, connection to nature that is future-proof, more sustainable. And I'm curious to know from your point of view, what kind of clues there might be in our landscapes that hark back to that indigenous culture, perhaps.
So what's happened in Europe is that because they've lost their aristocracy and they don't have the same rules of inheritance, very many countries in Europe don't have the ancient trees in quite the same way as we have here. So many of ours, in the sense of the medieval forest and the medieval deer parks, are maiden trees. And that is very different to the experience in Europe, where many of their old trees are actually pollards, and that's a commoning story. And we have a bit of the commoning story, or the story of the trees that are pollards in the hedgerows and things. We can glimpse that through enough of them that are left, but they're not really as strong as the ones that are in our historic parks and gardens. And so we have this unique position in UK, having these very special trees, which some of us would argue are the closest we can get to wild trees, from the way, if they're 1,000 years old, they're very unlikely to have been planted, but they've lived for 1,000 years in the open. How has that worked? And this should be influencing how we think about those trees, because this cohort of ancient trees of different species, they have species associated with them which you can't find on younger trees. And if you think deep ecology is deep, deep history, that is telling us not just about, going back 100 years or so. That is telling us about relationships that have evolved way, way, way back in time. And that, again, is something that we've really got to start thinking about and understanding, just at a time when they're under such pressure and they're sort of melting away in the landscape because so many people are not managing them as appropriately as they should be. Because in order for those trees, those ancient trees, to be in good heart, they've got to be in very good ground conditions, good soils. And that would take us back into really what I would think is the right landscape, or what I understand as being a really resilient landscape, is to have a wood pasture, basically. And I think those wood pastures are perhaps glimpsed most strongly again in the UK landscape, because sadly the word forest has been distorted into forestry. And actually, if you go back to the origins, forest meant a place which was outside the urban area, effectively, and it was the wildest. And it was full of wild animals, wild beasts, wild birds, wild plants, etc. And as that became smaller and smaller, and we developed more intensive farming techniques, so those areas became smaller. But they were protected by some of the best were protected by the Anglo-Saxon kings, and then that was taken over by the Norman kings. And so Sherwood, Wychwood, New Forest, these are famous names of forestry, but they date back to these wild woods of the Anglo-Saxons. And because of the nature of the animals and plants which are associated with the old trees, we know they date back even earlier than that. It's just that we don't have the historic records to prove it. We only have the ecology to prove it. These are glimpses of what the best landscapes were then. And I think from an ecology point of view, we know that diversity brings resilience. And that's what we've got to try and do. What we have learnt through the work of Franz Vera is that it should be a cyclical, here now in time, we should have every habitat working together across a landscape, every single bit of it present all the time, same time. Now, that's really challenging. And I think the only way we're seeing that at the moment is through some of the wilding projects that are present. And that's why I'm so keen on what we're seeing from NEP and other places like that. And they're proving it. The diversity is increasing in the wilded landscapes from all the factors that we're looking at, whereas in the more man-made attempts at managing wildlife, the most iconic species that we're trying to save are actually going down and they're extremely vulnerable. So we've got to do something different. And wilding is demonstrating that it is very beneficial.
On that cue, and your mentioning of the wildwood, can you describe a little bit how the difference in human relationship may have changed with trees?
So probably if we go back to the retreat of the Ice Age, then we were connected initially to Europe, and wild grazing animals would have roamed across the landscape. So we would have had a relatively full suite of herbivores and also carnivores, etc., roaming across the landscape. And we were hunter-gatherers at that time. We were initially, following the herds of wild animals, but then, of course, we started to bring mechanisms for taking herds with us, domesticated herds with us, and taking them around. And then, of course, we started to settle, and then we would have carved out farmland. And so more and more, the original landscape was being fragmented and separated from where we produced food and where we produced wood from the wilder landscape. And obviously, this process in the last 50 to 80 years has been accelerated at an incredible pace because of oil and the readiness of us to be able to drive around so easily and to use bigger and bigger tractors, etc., etc. So, we have now become almost entirely compartmentalized away from the original landscape, and that's very worrying.
Tell us a bit about Troby as well, the Tree Register of Britain and Ireland.
Yes, I'm a trustee of the Tree Register, and I think it's a fantastic micro charity, and that has such a fantastic back history as well, because it really sort of started around the time of John Evelyn. And if you know, John Evelyn was best buddies with Charles II. Charles II, his life was saved by a hollow old oak tree. The concept is, or much of the words are, that he hid in the crown of a tree, but actually there's much more likelihood that he hid in a pollard oak that was hollow in the middle, because, he had to hide in the tree for a long time, and hiding in the crown of a tree is very uncomfortable. Whereas if you can just sit inside a hollow tree, with your food and everything, surrounded by a trunk that hides you from everywhere else, I think that's more likely than trying to hide in the crown of a tree. Anyways, he was a great tree king when he came back. And he sent out his best buddy, John Evelyn, to do a survey of trees and woods in the English landscape. And John Evelyn wrote that up as silver. And that's where we have our first record of the greatest, the fattest trees. So the tree register records champion trees by girth and by height. And that's of all species. It's not just the native species. We've had a huge history of importing trees from China and other parts of Asia and America. And understanding how those trees grow in the British landscape is also incredibly important, because we may need to look at how they've grown in the past 100 years or longer and be deciding whether they are the future given climate change. So I think we're starting to think about this database of champion trees of all species as a really important source of information for the future.
Yeah, biodiversity loss, climate change, tree protection, they are at the moment, sadly, global issues. And it's really important we work collectively with other countries as well. And I know you've been on some interesting travels abroad as well. I just wonder if there's any learning you think we can take from other places that we could bring into tree management more generally.
Well, when I look at Europe, the country that stands out in terms of its ancient and veteran tree heritage or the countries, is the Iberian Peninsula. That's Spain and Portugal. Unbelievably important part of Europe that's still got huge landscapes of old trees, much, much bigger. And they are in a state where they are viable and sustainable at that sort of size and age of trees, and still having the traditional practices that are regenerating them. So Spain and Portugal are really fantastic, and it's really great if people could go and visit and see them. And then obviously there's Transylvania. Unfortunately, things are changing in Transylvania. There's some good news there, which they've actually brought in a new law in the last few years to protect their ancient and veteran trees, something we don't have at all and makes us extremely vulnerable. So Romania, one of the poorest countries in Europe, has actually had a national legislation to protect their trees, which is really good practice. But sadly, in terms of their traditional landscapes, the pressures of modern life are really having an impact on their landscapes. They've got masses of it, but a lot of it is being very significantly impacted. And then you could look at Scandinavia, and they've got some lovely areas of old trees, not really huge, but the Scandinavians absolutely understand the importance of these trees. They have legislation to protect them. But more to the point, the Scandinavians are the ones who are going to other countries and saying, wake up, other countries. This is an important part of our ecology and our landscape and our heritage and our history. And they are the ones that are actually trying to go out and encourage other countries to do more to look after them. So there is that. And then there's, glimpses. There's people like Professor David Lindenmayer from Australia. He's really done a huge amount to raise awareness of old and open-grown trees in Australia. And he's trying to influence from the other side of the world, the absolute other side of the world. There is a sort of a move to try and reach out and pull this all together at a world scale. I think UNESCO get it, because we've been to places like Sicily, and they've identified trees for UNESCO heritage status designation. So there's another good example. Can we raise the profile of how globally significant these old trees are? And I think, when you look at somewhere like Windsor Great Park or Sherwood or, at the New Forest, these are internationally important collections of old trees, and trying to raise awareness of that with people is really important.
Let me ask you something potentially controversial. Is there anything in your life that you treasure more than old trees?
Gosh. That's a big question, isn't it? Gosh, I'd probably say There's not much. There's certainly really nothing material that I could think of that's more important. But obviously, what I'd have to say is that in the process of visiting and seeing these trees, you meet such incredible tree people, and those relationships are incredibly precious. The people that I've met along the way, language is no barrier. You know, you can hardly talk to people. This is going to change possibly with translation apps and AI and all of that. But you can hardly communicate in terms of language, and yet you're on the same wavelength absolutely with the trees. And they are, you know, this is what I love, is that people like Thibaut Hartel in Romania is just working his socks off to try and look after the old trees in Romania, and has done so much for this law and raising the profile there. And then you've got, you know, a whole range of people in France and Spain who are doing their absolute most to try and look after these old trees, often against incredible odds, you know. So, you know, I think those relationships are very, very special, and I wouldn't give them up for the world.
Thanks, Jill. Would you like to leave our listeners with one last message?
Well, I've had such a privileged time. I really appreciate that life experience that I've had in nature. I just hope that we can pull ourselves back from the brink that I feel that we're on in time, so that as we have such serious climate and biodiversity crises, that we don't take down all those beautiful natural species that we've lived alongside. And it seems such a shame to me that, you know, we are risking not just our own human lives, but risking the beauty and diversity of the world, and risking that at the same time. And I wish we could really work together to find solutions, you know, to the problems that we've got.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.